From the Orlando Sentinel in 1987.
6 weeks after an Orlando judge admitted DNA fingerprints as evidence in a rape case, everybody with homicides to solve is asking about the tests. And even before one of the nation's foremost forensic laboratories, the FBI, is convinced of their accuracy, defendants are pleading guilty because of them. The case of Tommie Lee Andrews, who was sentenced to 22 years in prison, was the first successful prosecution in history which a defendant was identified by scientists from DNA molecules. If acceptance of the DNA test becomes widespread, forensic science and criminal law will be revolutionized. Devastating is how lawyers, biologists, and researchers describe the tool, which can clear the falsely accused as certainly as it damns the guilty.
If it turns out to be for real, it will totally change the face of criminal law,
said one of the attorneys who represented Tommie Andrews. There were no witnesses to the rape the 24-year-old warehouse supervisor, who once played football for Iowa State University, was accused of. He had an alibi, and the police had only a couple of fingerprints on a screen outside the victim's house. But Andrews could be identified by genetic material he left at the crime scene. DNA fingerprints offered dramatic and conclusive new evidence. Fingerprints had only proved that Andrews was outside the victim's house, and they couldn't be dated. DNA put him inside the house at the time of the crime.
If you find somebody's semen in a rape victim, that's the case,
the prosecutor said.
The test becomes the whole trial,
said one of the defense attorneys.
It's interesting, isn't it, to see how DNA was being discussed at its inception? They were calling it a DNA fingerprint, which isn't necessarily how we speak of it today, but it does help with a visual that you can understand when the actual science is a bit more clumsy to explain to the average newspaper reader. We also know that DNA isn't always a slam dunk. The idea that finding semen in a rape case was thought to be a smoking gun in 1987 seems wildly optimistic now, when history shows us that they weren't even testing rape kits widely at this time. In fact, we ended up with a national backlog, which resulted in a lot more rapes that, if they had tested them in the first place when they could have, many fewer offenses would have occurred. Tommie Andrews was, I'm sure to him anyway, the unfortunate recipient of technology's first great strides in DNA being used to help convict offenders. On March 2, 1987, an Orlando Sentinel article titled, "Man Held in 2 Rapes, Suspected in 11 Others," by Prakash Gandhi, hit the newsstands.
A 23-year-old prowling suspect was charged with attempted murder and sexual battery Sunday, and is a suspect in as many as 13 rapes in southeast Orlando and unincorporated Orange County during the past few months. Tommie Lee Andrews, 1665 Oak Ridge Road, is being questioned about a series of attacks that began last summer. 4 of the 5 rapes that Orlando police are investigating have occurred since January 1st. 8 other attacks have occurred in the county over a longer period. Orange County Sheriff's spokesman said Andrews fit the description of the man believed responsible for the attacks. Andrews was arrested after police responded to a call about a man looking through a bedroom window in the South Curry Ford Road area about 2:30 a.m. Sunday. A rape victim identified Andrews as her attacker during a photographic lineup. They charged Andrews with kidnapping, 3 counts of sexual battery and burglary with assault. The victim told detectives that on January 11th, Andrews broke into her home at night and raped her. Orange County Sheriff's officials also held a photographic lineup Sunday in which another victim identified Andrews as her attacker. They then charged Andrews with attempted murder, involuntary sexual battery, kidnapping, armed burglary to an occupied dwelling with an assault and armed robbery. That victim told detectives that on May 9th, she saw the suspect in her home shortly after she came home from work. She tried to run away, but the man grabbed her and threw her to the floor. As she screamed, he hit her in the face, threatened to kill her unless she stayed quiet, and then stabbed her in the left thigh and left palm. She was then dragged into a bedroom and raped. The man covered her face with a sheet, made her walk into the living room and lie down on the floor where he raped her again, and took her purse and left. Detectives say that although accounts have varied, there are enough similarities in the suspect's description, his method of attack, and the neighborhoods to convince them the same man is responsible. Most of the victims are white and in their 20s and 30s.
So a summary of Tommie Andrews' cases looks a bit like this. In 1987, he became the first person in the country to be convicted of a violent crime based on DNA. There were 2 trials that year where he was found guilty of rape. The first case ended in a mistrial. The next month, the second case was tried using the same DNA evidence, and he was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Then, in February of 1988, the prosecutors took another stab at it, and they retried Tommie Andrews for the rape in the case that had previously ended in mistrial. They were successful, and he was sentenced to 78 years for that conviction. Later, the courts would reduce that sentence to a 40-year term. Now, Tommie Andrews has always maintained his innocence. In court, though, multiple victims identified Tommie Andrews as their attacker. In 2003, he appealed his second guilty verdict, hoping to get a new trial. He wanted the DNA evidence retested, given that there were significant advances in technology by then. In an 83-page handwritten missive, Andrews laid out the basis upon which he requested the DNA to be retested. He accused multiple agencies, including the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the Sheriff's Office, of swapping DNA samples, of altering the official police report, of doctoring the results, the police report, and relabeling sample sheets, also submitting false data entries and falsifying the DNA report itself. Essentially, Tommie Andrews was alleging what would have amounted to a vast conspiracy along multiple agencies to railroad him, because what he alleged would require at least a dozen conspirators in multiple agencies and positions. I mean, you gotta hand it to him. Go big or go home, right? He was trying to get a new trial, alleging a Brady violation, but his proposed new evidence was his flotilla of spurious allegations that had no basis in fact. And unsurprisingly, his bid was denied. In 2012, just days from his prison release date, it was time for his hearing to determine whether he would be released or sent to a treatment facility for sex offenders under Florida's Jimmy Rice Act. During that hearing, which would be in front of a jury, Tommie Andrews chose to represent himself. And you know what they say, a man who represents himself has a fool for a client, but I don't think Tommie Andrews is a fool. The amount of voluminous handwritten motions that he submitted to the court over the years tells me that he at least knows his way around a prison library. But I will further opine that he may have had a more sinister motive for wanting to be the person who stood in front of his victims in court with the ability to address them directly, a privilege he would otherwise not have if he had a lawyer to represent him. Having the opportunity to stare down your victim while asking them details of the rape that you perpetrated against them would be very intimidating. Now, we've all probably taken note of the types of offenders who make that choice to represent themselves. These are the types who get satisfaction out of further victimizing their victims under the thin guise of exercising their constitutional rights. So let's just say it tells you a little bit about what makes Tommie Andrews tick. Tommie Andrews was only ever convicted of 2 rapes, one that took place on May 9th, 1986, and the other incident occurred in February of 1987. One early news article, though, mentioned that he was a suspect in 13 cases. And all these years later, I am not clear on whether law enforcement was sure that he was the perpetrator in the other 11, or whether, having successfully convicted 2 cases, prosecutors decided, after securing a hefty conviction, that the resulting cost-benefit analysis of further prosecutions wasn't worth their resources. I found at a press conference related to another serial rapist who operated in the area, but during a time frame that preceded Tommie's offenses, Tommie's name was brought up. This presser was related to a man named George Gertman, who was dubbed the Malibu Rapist, named for the geographical area where he offended in Orlando. At this press conference, one intrepid reporter asked this question, which you will see was pivoted away from rather quickly.
Should have been quicker. I have a question and a follow-up. It's in related cases. As you know, Gertman is facing the life term right now. But as you know, your office is involved in a bench trial for Tommie Lee Andrews, also a serial rapist in Orlando, in a few weeks, for him to seek release. My first question is, isn't it possible to go back and get the cases from the 4 women, some of them were with the sheriff's office, who were his victims back then, and were told 35 years ago, we don't need to prosecute your case because he's going to stay in jail forever, and yet he could be released in just a few weeks. Is that possible, and are you going to do that?
You're talking in Mr. Andrews' case?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to speak on that today. I'm not prepared, and I'm here for the Gertman case today.
Okay. So my follow-up question is,
yes,
are you at least going to allow the victims in his cases to be able to, or recommend to the judge that they present statements?
Again, I'm not going to speak on that, but generally the state attorney's office gets cases from law enforcement. So things have to initiate with a law enforcement agency, and then it can come to us. That's really generally how things work.
Lieutenant, is it going to be initiated in an OPD case?
If you're speaking on Orange County cases with Mr. Andrews, then I don't
think they were all Orange County. I think at least one was an OPD case.
Yeah, I don't have any of that information right now for you. Sorry about that.
Now let me just step back and make sure that you understand the purpose of this hearing that was mentioned. Tommie Andrews finished his prison sentence in 2012, having served 24 years. But Florida has what's called the Jimmy Rice Act, where violent sexual offenders can be held beyond their release date from prison until they can make a persuasive argument to the court to release them. The Jimmy Rice Involuntary Civil Commitment for Sexually Violent Predators Treatment and Care Act was passed unanimously by the Florida legislature and became effective on January 1st, 1999. This act requires that inmates with histories of sex offenses be reviewed by the Florida Department of Corrections, the Florida Department of Children and Family Services, and state attorneys. Upon release from incarceration, these violent sexual offenders may be subject to civil proceedings and commitment to a secure facility for treatment. The idea here is that the panel will determine the risk level of reoffense, and on its face, this seems to be a pretty good idea, given what we know about how sexual offenders are often repeat offenders. And that's what happened in the case of Tommie Andrews. He was released from prison, but subsequently remanded to another facility until he could prove he was unlikely to reoffend. I think it's informative here to define recidivism, which is the reversion to criminal behavior by an offender who was previously convicted of a criminal offense, and that word applies not only to that offender's reoccurring failure to abide by the law, but it also refers to the failure of our justice system to correct that behavior. There are lots of factors that go into determining the possibility of someone reoffending, including personal and societal factors, but it's not just a term that means repeat offending. Technically, recidivism refers to a reoccurrence of illegal behavior after an individual experiences legal consequences or correctional interventions that are meant to eliminate that behavior or prevent it from happening again. According to the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking, or SMART for short, sexual recidivism rates range from 5% after 3 years to 24% after 15 years. Add to that the fact that researchers agree that rape is an underreported crime, and that means that the recidivism rates would be underestimates of the true offenses of sex offenders. In one 3-year study, inmates who had been incarcerated specifically for rape or sexual assault had an overall recidivism rate of 29.1% 1 year after release. In another long-term study, those recidivism rates jumped from 14% after a 5-year follow-up to 24% after a 15-year follow-up. Those statistics are staggering. Knowing what we know with the benefit of hindsight, it becomes glaringly apparent that these predators have historically benefited in the form of ineffectual sentences that are less than appropriate given the possibility of reoffense, while their victims have endured everything from not having their rape kits tested to not being believed when they come forward. The disparity in how we have sought justice for victims in these cases against how we dispose of the cases perpetrated against them is perhaps the largest gap in equity of any type of criminal offense. We as humans get that murderers need to be locked away, and if there's a child involved, we're happy to throw away the key. But when it comes to violent sexual offenses against women, our country and culture has not yet met its burden. Our justice system does not appropriately safeguard women against repeat offenders. The victims of a violent offender like Tommie Andrews have an absolute right to be concerned about the possibility of him reoffending in the future. During the bench trial, the state called 2 experts that testified to their belief, based on their review of the case and interviews with Tommie Andrews, that he not only continues to deny his guilt in the cases where he was convicted, he refused therapy while in the treatment center, and they believed he had a mental disorder that fueled his compulsion to commit violent sexual acts.
I woke up to a blade at my throat and him saying, "If you move, I'm going to kill you."
He denied that he committed his crimes and he did not demonstrate remorse.
So he still remains at a high risk of reoffending.
The grandiosity, the need for the sense of entitlement.
I believe that those types of problems are contributors to his history of sexual offending.
And the lack of remorse.
Feel confident that he will come out and do, and worse, so much worse. He's got violence in him that is hidden.
This man is not normal. He's very dangerous, and he's going to do it again. And he's probably going to be a step beyond what he was doing before. So, yeah, I am very worried.
Tommie Lee Andrews was 49 years old in 2012 when that hearing was held. He had initially received a 100-year sentence for his 2 prior convictions combined, but that sentence was reduced over the years through appeals and good behavior. It was recalculated to 62 years and was further reduced by about 21 years because of a law at the time that automatically took off 1/3 of every prisoner's sentence. Since 1988, he had earned about 16 years of what's called gain time, or time off for good behavior. So he had barely served a fraction of his sentence as he stood before his victims and had what I am certain was the pleasure of asking them pointed questions in open court. One victim described how he broke into her house and threatened to kill her with a knife and then raped her repeatedly while her children slept in a room nearby. At one point she sobbed as she described the anguish of not knowing whether her 3- and 5-year-olds at the time were asleep or if he had already killed them. When it was his turn to question her, Tommie Andrews asked her whether the person she described to police as her attacker matched his description.
"I didn't get a good look at you. I knew you were bigger than me."
When he asked another of his victims on the stand how she picked her attacker, she replied,
"I don't remember which picture I picked. I picked your face."
Dr. Amy Swan said,
"The best indication of future behavior is past behavior. Mr. Andrews has shown us that he rapes women."
The result of that hearing, which included 3 full days of testimony from his victims, law enforcement, and experts, was that the jury deemed Tommie Andrews a sexually violent predator, and that designation gave the state the authority to send him to a sexual treatment center under the Jimmy Rice Act. By this time, Andrews had married while incarcerated, and his wife Judy, the woman who would later contact law enforcement to ask about his sister Mabel Andrews' case, well, she exited the courtroom. While only 2 of his victims got their day in court, which resulted in the convictions, other victims of Tommie Andrews were present, other victims whose cases included evidence taken from their homes that, according to law enforcement, also connected their assaults to Tommie Andrews. After his commitment, during a TV news interview with News 13's Kelly Cook, he said,
"I've never had any mental problems over 25 years of my whole life. I've never taken any medication through prison.
Tommie Andrews said that he had never raped anyone at knife point and was never in any of their houses, despite fingerprint and DNA evidence. During this same interview, one of his victims, who never got her day in court, was able to speak to Tommie Andrews and ask some questions. She texted the interviewer, who facilitated by asking the questions of Andrews. She wanted to know why Tommie refused any evaluation and treatment while he was in prison, and why he had never shown any remorse. His response?
That won't happen.
She sent a voicemail message to the reporter that was played for Tommie Andrews during that interview.
I'd like to tell Mr. Andrews, we're about the same age when all this happened. I think it's time to get the help you need at the facility that you're going to. Get right with God and ask for forgiveness.
His response was shocking.
I'm going to disclose something that I've never disclosed before in 25 years. I went to Cherokee Junior High School. She went to Cherokee Junior High School. It's like you want to say, I know you remember me and you know what type of person I was. And it was like, why didn't this person say, I remember you? I used to talk to you and you never said anything or went out of your way to treat anyone bad.
Now, let's set aside the fact that what he appears to be saying is that he thinks this woman, his victim, the woman he raped, should have spoken up for what a good kid he was in junior high, which is bizarre. But Tommie Andrews knew this woman prior to the rape. He had gone to the same junior high school. When she heard this, she was shocked. She didn't remember him, but he sure remembered her. When the reporter asked if he would die in the commitment center before admitting he was guilty, Tommie Andrews said, I'll live by it and I'll die by it. It was on November 8, 2013, after being sent to the Civil Commitment Center, that Tommie Andrews petitioned the court to declare his sister Mabel Andrews deceased. And that's sort of why I have told you Tommie's story. Because why? What did that man hope to gain from having his sister declared dead? It nagged at me as I tried to figure out what his angle was. What was he after? I still haven't figured that one out. In 2014, they were back in court again to revisit whether Tommie Andrews should be released from the Florida Civil Commitment Center. Dr. Amy Swan interviewed him again, and she told the court this.
Mr. Andrews actually recounted what kind of car I had, that I had a vanity plate on the car, and that the headrest on the passenger side was set very high.
Dr. Swan described this as stalking behavior, but a psychologist who testified in his defense, after studying his case and interviewing Tommie Andrews, said that she believed he might in fact be innocent, despite being convicted by 2 separate juries and the DNA evidence. Her conclusion was, I think there's significant doubt. In the end, his 2014 bid for release was again unsuccessful. Fast forward to 2021, and the now 57-year-old rapist was back in court to take another swipe at freedom. The assistant state attorney said that his behavior had not changed.
He has issues involving sexual deviance because he has not accepted responsibility for his behavior. He has not acknowledged that there is any reason for him to accept responsibility for his behavior, and he has never engaged meaningfully in treatment.
Another forensic psychologist testified that he was likely to commit additional sexual violence because he refused to engage in treatment.
There appears to be a theme currently related to feelings of victimization. He has resisted attempts to take responsibility for his decisions and the resulting consequences.
Mr. Andrews has never thought he needed treatment, and he does not see himself as a sex offender. He doesn't see a problem. He is who he is. He's right and everyone's wrong.
Tommie's lawyer insisted that his client had shown no indication of sexual preoccupation in 3 decades and deemed him unlikely to reoffend. He said that he had behaved well in the facility and had no major disciplinary strikes against his record.
There was simply no danger, no risk at all pointed out in those reports. We have a person who's been 33 years symptom-free. There's been no sexually acting out, neither in the Department of Corrections nor the Florida Civil Commitment Center. No violence at all. no indication of sexual preoccupation, and a number of other dynamic factors which we will get into during the course of the trial.
A psychologist who worked at the Civil Commitment Center said they saw no evidence that Tommie Andrews had a personality disorder, sexual deviancies, or disciplinary issues, and that he no longer met the criteria for involuntary commitment. Tommie Andrews' victims pleaded yet again to deny his request to be freed from the state facility.
This is not a man who should be let out to society. The world has enough evil out there to deal with.
One victim said that she no longer even felt sadness. Now she just felt numb and worthless.
This man stole so much of my life. Why does this man get to continually pull us back into court and make us relive the horror? When will there be closure? When will we have peace again?
The problem was that it was essentially out of the judge's hands.
These bench trials will continue to occur either until he's released or if he dies. You all need to understand that it is his legal right. He has the right to petition the court for release. I wish that the courts had made this very easy for victims, but it's just not how it exists.
And then, for the victims, the unthinkable happened. On August 27, 2021, the judge granted Tommie Lee Andrews release.
I feel like she didn't care, that it didn't bother her one bit what he did to us.
They thought, well, he wasn't going to get out until he was in his 70s. So they dropped these others and let it go and assured us that he would stay behind bars. And that hasn't happened.
So a few things stood out to me in my research, which concerned me. A psychiatrist for the prosecution testified that Andrews suffers from a paraphilia and personality disorder. If those are accurate diagnoses, these are not things that just go away, particularly when you refuse treatment. Then there was that almost sinister testimony about his stalking behavior, with that information that he had rattled off about the psychologist's car and her headrest and her vanity plate. That clearly showed that he was not only watching her closely, but I would say that's someone with boundary control issues. And we've also got information that backs that up, that came from Tommie himself in that interview that he did right after being sent to the civil commitment facility, where he disclosed that he had gone to junior high with one of his victims. Apparently he never even hit her radar in junior high, but Tommie remembered her, and then he kept that information secret for over 20 years, never disclosing it during the rape investigations. He never mentioned he knew the woman, and you have to ask yourself why that is. It's almost scary to think about how their paths intersected again and what he may or may not have done to make that happen. Now, you guys know that I don't take you on one of these roundabout journeys for nothing. There was a point to my side quest into the brother of Mabel Andrews and his storied history with violence. Well, maybe not so much a point as an observation. I only learned about Tommie Lee Andrews while I was researching Mabel's case, and I even recall asking one detective if he had been looked at related to her going missing. I never got an answer to that, and he would have been around 13 at the time that she went missing, so I'd be hard-pressed to put him at the top of that list, given that age. But I was curious about his profile, the ways he offended, his use of a knife and threatening to kill his victims. It made me wonder if there's a possibility there are more victims out there, perhaps even homicides that we just don't know about. Tommie Andrews played football at Jones High School in Orlando, and he graduated in June of 1981, about 5 years after his sister Mabel had gone missing. In one of the depositions of his former employer from 1986, around the time he was actively raping, the employer said that Tommie mentioned he had previously worked for an Orange County agency that involved recreation for kids. So I sent a records request to Orange County to see if I could get his HR file. While I waited, I went through old newspaper archives and I found a few lines in one of the articles about his arrest. An Iowa State spokeswoman told the Orlando Sentinel that
he began as a non-scholarship player in the university's JV football team in 1981. He was given a scholarship a year later, and was a second-team defensive back as a junior in 1983, before getting hurt and quitting the team.
But in the beginning of 1984, in February, the Iowa Gazette reported this.
Speaking of Iowa State football, Kreiner has dismissed 2 members of his 1983 squad for disciplinary reasons. Curtis Livingston, part-time starter, and Tommie Andrews, sub-defensive back.
That quick blurb did not elaborate on what the disciplinary reason was. Tommie graduated from Iowa State in May of '85 and returned to Orlando, Florida shortly thereafter. Then I got that HR request back from Orange County, and I went through his employment records. On his employment application, he listed 4 of his relatives who also worked for Orange County. He named Ames Park and Recreation in Iowa as his most recent employer. He worked there for about a year as basketball coach for 12 and 13-year-old boys. He said that program ended in April of 1985. There's no word on whether he had another job for the 7-month period between then and when he moved home and began working for the county. If he did, he didn't list it. The rest of his previous work history were employers that he had before he left Florida while he was still in high school. I was a bit startled to learn that he had listed the Orlando Police Department as a previous employer. His supervisor was Lieutenant Rick Detreville, and he was hired in October of '79, which was when he was about 16 years old. On the Orange County application for employment, he listed this in description of his job with the Orlando Police.
Public relation representative. Visited high-ranking authorities to better community conditions. Parks, businesses, offices, etc.
Then he worked in Orlando from June '80 to '81 as a recreation supervisor for the Police Athletic League. Here, Tommie described his work as supervising and assisting recreation. Lieutenant Detreville was the athletic league board president, so it appears that Tommie Andrews worked directly under him for about 2 years while he was in high school. Now, I just want to be clear about something. I'm not making any insinuations about OPD or Orange County hiring 16-year-old Tommie Lee Andrews, a kid who plays football for a local high school, getting a job in the community, particularly in a field working with kids related to sports activities. There's nothing abnormal about that. In fact, it's something that you do to pad your college transcripts. It's only in hindsight, when we ponder his violent history, that we wonder about someone like that having worked in any capacity with children. I tend to wonder how early his proclivities emerged, if psychologists essentially called him a predator and a sexual deviant. The county job for which he was applying when he returned from Iowa State after graduation was at a place called Great Oaks Village, and the position was a youth care worker. Great Oaks Village was a home in South Orlando that provided short-term shelter for Orange County children ages 5 to 17 who had been neglected, abandoned, or abused. Children who had been removed from their homes for whatever reason. Children were placed there through the juvenile court system, where they were held pending either foster placement or return to their homes after the problems had been resolved. So Tommie was hired, and at his 1-month employment mark on January 29, 1986, Tommie was given a probationary review. These were the comments.
30-day expectations. Needs to be more assertive. Keep in mind that the job is interacting with and supervising residents. Initial time card had errors. Has come to work late on various occasions, occasionally without calling, or calling in late.
Tommie's quality of work and job knowledge adequacy scores were categorized as needs improvement, and his dependability and work habits were given an unacceptable rating. Whatever his job performance may have been during the 2 years he worked for the county prior to college, once he returned home, it doesn't seem like this work was a good fit for Tommie Andrews. He made it about 3 months on that job with Great Oaks Village. At the end of his probationary period in March of '86, he was terminated for poor work performance. Similar complaints would be noted by another employer at a warehouse job that he had when he was arrested for rape. And there was at least one other job in between there that didn't last long. It's very troubling when you consider that he was committing violent rapes Right around the same time, he was also working with troubled youths. It makes you wonder if there is any correlation between him being tossed from the football team for disciplinary reasons and his state of mind once he made it back home from college. I noted his use of a knife while committing his rapes. These were violent assaults, where they were stabbed or cut during the commission of these crimes. I also had a list of black female homicide victims from the same area between 1979 and 1985, 3 of which I knew had died by stabbing. The 4th, I didn't know how she was killed. Now, I'm not saying I think all of these are related, or even that Tommie Lee Andrews is involved in any of these things, but I do try to look for patterns. And I found that one of those victims, named Tracy Miller, who was last seen walking in an area very near Lake Man before she was found dead in 1985, lived in the same apartment complex on Oak Ridge Road that Tommie Lee Andrews lived at when he was arrested. It's on his arrest affidavit. So this woman who was killed after walking around the Lake Man area lived in the same apartment complex as Tommie Lee Andrews when she was murdered. I have had one hell of a time prying information about the next 4 victims out of law enforcement. I even tried the ME's office to get the cause of death on the one victim that I wasn't sure about, because all of the others were stabbed. But I would get a no from them as well, the sheriff's department, citing open ongoing investigations. And one of the 4, the sheriff's department doesn't even have the correct birth date on their unsolved homicide page, nor was her name spelled correctly. I had been searching for her for weeks and I couldn't find anything because I had the wrong data. It took me sending away for a copy of her death certificate to get the correct information. I would like to be able to tell you more about the next 4 victims, all young, black girls and women, all who got little to no mention in the media. In the next and final episode, I will tell you the little I do know about the remaining 4 cases this season. Stay tuned. Music courtesy of Blue Dot Sessions.